Good evening, welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Gordon Ross, and in the programme this evening we'll be joined by Anthony Salamone, who has now written a new paper on Brexit's reorientation of Scottish politics to the Royal Society of Art. So welcome to you, Anthony, and we'll come back to talking about your paper later in the programme after the news headlines.
That's good, Gordon.
Okay, so first off, the coronavirus update. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,521,121 people in Scotland have now been tested through NHS Scotland laboratories and the UK government's regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,351,422 were confirmed negative, 169,699 were positive. There are 1,480 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. This will be an underestimate of the number of cases. Not everyone with the virus displays the symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There were 71 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus COVID-19 infections now stands at 5,628. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. Of the people who have tested positive, 2,053 were in hospital last night, 161 of whom were in intensive care. 358,454 people have now received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination, and 4,689 have received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures published today show that 95,981 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 1,401 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just to hospitals. Now, if you'd like to join the conversation here tonight, you can, of course, do so on Twitter by following us at Broadcast Scot and using the hashtag Scotland at 7. And now to tonight's main news stories and efforts of Scotland to stay in Erasmus. Ministers have welcomed the support of around 150 members of the European Parliament, MEPs, who have asked the European Commission to explore how Scotland could continue to take part in the popular Erasmus exchange programme. The move comes a week after Further and Higher Education Minister Richard Lochhead held productive talks with European Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture and Education and Youth, Mariah Gabriel, to explore the idea. Until last year, over 2,000 Scottish students, staff and learners took part in the scheme annually, with Scotland attracting proportionately more Erasmus participants from across Europe, and sending more in the other direction than any other country in the United Kingdom. Mr Lochhead said losing Erasmus is a huge blow for the thousands of Scottish students, community groups and adult learners from all demographic backgrounds who can no longer live, study or work in Europe. It also closes the door for people to come to Scotland on Erasmus to experience our country and culture. I'm grateful to Terry Rentke and the other MEPs for their efforts, and I thank them for extending the hand of friendship and solidarity to Scotland's young people, and I sincerely hope that we can succeed. Now, our next report, Guardian says that the foreign NHS workers could be denied COVID vaccine in England. The Guardian is reporting that foreign NHS workers treating COVID patients are at risk of being denied vaccinations because of internal guidelines about who can receive the jab. Documents circulated among staff at one leading hospital show vaccinators have been told that they must not immunise anyone without an NHS number. A senior source at the NHS Trust said that the instruction was disproportionately likely to affect foreign nurses and people from a black, Asian or minority ethnic background who had not registered with the GP. We're basically being told to turn away ethnic minorities and foreigners who are fundamental to the delivery of healthcare in this country, the source said. The Department of Health and Social Care said that having an NHS number should never be a precondition for the coronavirus vaccination. This is understood to be echoed by NHS England. The issue has arisen due to National Immunisation Vaccination System, or NIVS, which the NHS uses to record details of medical staff who have been immunised. Details cannot be uploaded without an NHS number, according to official instructions on how to use the NIVS issued by the NHS Digital and Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. The document says that where staff do not have an NHS number, the vaccine should not be given. One email sent to the hospital explicitly states that overseas nurses without NHS numbers should not be vaccinated, although those from the devolved nations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, can be recorded on paper. And now there are calls to scrap Trident nuclear weapons. The SNP has said Westminster's stance on nuclear weapons leaves the UK badly out of touch with the vast majority of nations ahead of the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, today, Friday. The treaty has been signed and ratified by 51 countries, which is enough to bring it legally into force, meaning that from this month, countries that have signed will not cooperate or assist any country in remaining nuclear armed or nuclear complicit. However, the UK government is not a signatory to it. Earlier this week, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon endorsed the Scottish Women's Covenant on the TPNW, which also enters into force today as the first nuclear disarmament treaty to acknowledge that women were disproportionately affected by nuclear weapons. The SNP has consistently been a leading voice on nuclear disarmament, while the Tories and Labour support wasting billions of public money imposing new Trident nuclear weapons on the Clyde. There have also now been calls for inhumane approach to asylum seekers by the UK government to be stopped. SNP MPs are demanding immediate action from the UK government following the inhumane approach to vulnerable asylum seekers in Napier Barracks in Kent, which they are calling on to be closed immediately. Residents have been banned from leaving their accommodation following a number of individuals testing positive for COVID-19 on Saturday. The former army base, which was developed into accommodation for asylum seekers arriving in the UK, is now thought to be housing more than 400 individuals, with up to 28 sleeping in the same room, clearly risking an increased spread of COVID-19. The decision brings into question the safety of accommodation of residents who don't currently have the virus, but in the current accommodation may be unable to isolate in line with the current government guidelines. The SNP is now calling on the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, and the Immigration Minister, Chris Philip, to take immediate action before lives are lost. And now to Essex and Essex lorry drivers' deaths. I'll read this story again. Essex lorry deaths, gang members are to be jailed. The two ringleaders of the people smuggling gang responsible for the deaths of 39 Vietnamese people who suffocated in a sealed refrigeration container as they were being transported across the Channel from France have received prison sentences of 27 and 20 years. Ronan Hughes, 41, who ran a haulage company and organised the lorries and drivers to transport the migrants, was sentenced to 20 years at the Old Bailey today. He pleaded guilty last year to 39 counts of manslaughter and conspiring to bring people into the country unlawfully. His co-conspirator, Gorgi Nica, 43, a Romanian lorry mechanic who helped coordinate the transport of migrants and who was found guilty last year of manslaughter and people smuggling, was sentenced by Mr. Justice Sweeney to 27 years in prison. Maurice Robinson, 26, the lorry driver from Northern Ireland who collected the container containing the 39 people from the port in Essex in October of 2019, and also pleaded guilty last year to manslaughter and people smuggling, was also sentenced to 13 years and 4 months. The victims were 28 men, 8 women and 3 children, 2 of them aged 15. When it became obvious that there was insufficient oxygen, they made desperate attempts to escape through the roof of the container as they tried to call for emergency services in Vietnam. As they began to die inside the dark container where the temperature had risen to 38.5 degrees Celsius, they recorded farewell messages to their relatives. The judge said that they died excruciatingly slow deaths of asphyxia and hypothermia or overheating. And now in post-Brexit, Ireland and France cut out the UK middleman. Confronted by red tape and delays after the UK's messy exit from the European Union, Irish traders are shipping goods directly to and from European ports, shunning the once speedier route via the UK. All 5 operators connecting Ireland to mainland Europe have increased ferry services in the past 9 months, with some bringing forward planned sailings and others moving larger ships away from quieter British routes to meet new demand. For decades, the land bridge offered Irish traders the swiftest and most reliable route to continental Europe. It involves a short sea crossing between Dublin and Holyhead in Wales, and then a hop between Dover and Calais. Every year, 150,000 lorries use the route. But post-Brexit paperwork and delays in customs clearances are snarling up the process, adding hours or days to journeys and ratcheting up costs. Many companies have now switched routes. Stena Line, the largest Irish Sea operator, has doubled its services on the booming Rosslare to Cherbourg route, temporarily cancelling some sailings to the UK after freight volumes fell 60% in the first half of January. Irish Ferries has deployed a larger vessel out of Dublin and plan to add more weekly rotations next month, the Port of Cherbourg said. Brittany Ferries also brought forward a planned sailing linking France and Ireland. The Danish operator DFDS said the freight ferries plying its new 23-hour crossing from Rosslare to Dunkirk 6 days a week were pretty much full. The route director Aidan Coffey said capturing 30% of the land bridge traffic would make the route viable, and DFDS might soon add up to 2 more sailings per week. Now, the House of Representatives is to deliver its Trump impeachment charge on Monday. The Democrat-controlled US House of Representatives will deliver an impeachment charge against former President Donald Trump to the Senate on Monday, rejecting Republican Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's request for a delay. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who displaced McConnell as the chamber's leader after the Democrats won 2 Georgia runoff elections this month, announced the move on the Senate floor, but did not say when Trump's second impeachment trial would begin. The House will deliver the article of impeachment to the Senate. The Senate will conduct a trial of the impeachment of Donald Trump. It will be a full trial and it will be a fair trial, Schumer said on the Senate floor today. Trump's fate ultimately could depend on McConnell, whose position is likely to influence other Republican senators. The Kentucky Republican said this week that the mob was fed lies and provoked by the president and other powerful people. Now, the US Senate has also confirmed the first black American to become defense secretary. In the United States Senate today, President Joe Biden's nominee, retired Army General Lloyd Austin, was confirmed as the Secretary of Defense, the first black American in the role. The vote was an overwhelming 93-2 in the 100-member chamber, far more than the simple majority needed. Lawmakers from both parties said that they were pleased that Austin would be installed to lead the Pentagon just 2 days after Biden was sworn in as president on Wednesday. Senator Jack Reed, the incoming Democratic chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, noted a wide range of challenges facing the country, including the coronavirus pandemic and competition with China and Russia. General Austin is an exceptionally qualified leader with a long and distinguished career in the US military, Reid said before the vote. And now to our supporting health and social care staff. Additional funding of £500,000 is being allocated to provide practical measures of support for health and social care staff working to tackle the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland. Following direct feedback from staff, this funding will support local provision of hot drinks and snacks and other measures to aid rest and recuperation during their shifts, which will support their well-being and ease some pressures they face at work. Enhanced wellbeing support services backed by £5 million are already in place to support health and social care staff. This includes the National 24-Hour Helpline, staffed by trained psychological practitioners, and the National Wellbeing Hub, which is helping staff to cope with stress, anxiety and resilience. And now, entering the second part of tonight's programme, I'm going to be talking at length with Anthony Salamone about his recently published paper on Brexit's reorientation of Scottish politics. So again, welcome back to the programme, Anthony. It's been a little while since you and I spoke, but it's nice to see you back, and I'm happy to be discussing what I think is probably the first broad overview of Scottish politics in the post-Brexit era. What was it that, first of all, Anthony, that provoked you to prepare this paper at this exact moment?
Well, thank you, Gordon. I suppose from my mind, it was useful to take a step back and think about how Brexit has impacted our political system in a wider sense, because of course we have regrettably lived Brexit from day to day since the EU referendum. And we've witnessed all the various stages of the negotiations to leave the European Union, and then the negotiations to try and find a future relationship, and so on, and all the tumult associated with that, general elections and the rest of it. But to really step back and think that Brexit has really transformed our politics more broadly in terms of the political parties, the positions that they take, how the independence debate has adapted and in many respects become intertwined with Brexit and become changed as a result of it. And of course, how public opinion has changed, both not necessarily on Brexit, but of course on independence. And then the deterioration of devolution. All of that has all happened at once, and it's really quite remarkable.
It certainly is, Anthony. I'd like to take you up on what you were saying just at the beginning of your answer to my first question, and that is the reshaping of the Scottish parties in Holyrood, and what seems to have happened to not so much the Tories and the SNP, because the Tories and the SNP have effectively polarised. We all know that the SNP has a pro-European stance. And the Tories, I think, was widely predicted that they would fall in line with government policy. But what I wanted to ask you about is, what do you think is going to happen to Labour at the moment? They seem to have reached a bit of a crossroads. Keir Starmer announcing that he thinks there should not be a Scottish referendum seems, at least on the face of it, to provide Scottish Labour with a huge problem.
Yes, I think so. You're quite right that, from the early days after the EU referendum, we started to see this strong polarization, this alignment between, support for independence and support for Europe on the one side, and support for the UK Union and support for Brexit, or if not, at least support for Brexit, then at least passive on Brexit on the other side. And, if you want it's very difficult to try to maintain both, which I think Labour would say that was their position of wanting to be pro-European and pro-UK. That's clear, that's not an option anymore. That kind of ideology is obsolete. You can either be in the UK or you can be in the EU. And I think that throughout the Brexit process, Labour and also the Liberal Democrats in Scotland, tried to try to walk a middle line there of saying, we're sort of going along with Brexit, but we're pro-European, and you try to find different ways of expressing that. For instance, saying that they would support an extension of the transition period, or arguing for a soft Brexit. All of that is over, and the ability for Labour, if they wanted to try to have that kind of differentiation, is gone. And on the question of UK Labour and Starmer's approach to an independence referendum, yes, he certainly staked his position out, and I think it's a very challenging one. I wrote about his speech. I wrote about it last week. And it was a very strange kind of argument to make. He talked about, every time he talked about independence, he called it separatism, which is not a great way to convince voters to return to Labour, given that a clear majority of people in Scotland, presumably including current and former Labour voters, support independence, and independence is the mainstream position. So yeah, Labour has lots of challenges, and I don't think the UK Labour's approach, is going to help.
Well, the Labour Party in Scotland, in recent sort of polling of their own party members, it was revealed that up to 40% of Labour Party members in Scotland would vote for independence. Do you think that there is a chance that with the new direction of British Labour, with Keir Starmer steering British Labour very firmly towards Brexit and the acceptance of Brexit and the rejection of independence, that there is a substantial chance that the Labour Party might split into two parties? There could be perhaps a Labour Independence Party and a Labour Unionist Party, or some other kind of strange division between the two.
Well, I suppose one element of that, one key element, would be who wins the race to be the next leader of Scottish Labour, following Richard Leonard's extraordinarily rapid demission several months before the election, if the election happens as scheduled. So obviously Anna Sauer is ostensibly the favoured candidate, but and then he's much more against a new referendum and so on. But Monica Lennon, the challenger, seems to be much more open to the general idea, which I think any Democrat could be signed up to, which is that if a majority of the Scottish Parliament wants for an independence referendum to happen, there should be one, regardless of your view on independence. So I think, if she seems to be less likely to win, based on what people are saying at the moment, but if she were to win, for instance, then yes, you could see a stronger difference between what Scottish Labour is saying, what UK Labour is saying. I think it's relatively less likely at this point that there would be a split in terms of two different parties, because they've come this far of trying to, keep themselves together. If anything, we were always talking about with the Scottish Conservatives trying to break from the UK Conservatives. That was an option for them, and they clearly decided not to do that. So no, I think that the parties that we have will probably stay the way they are for now. But I do think that the political system, the party system, would change after independence or after independence referendum. So I think things would stay the same for now and would change after a referendum in favor of independence.
In the period, Anthony, before independence, before an independence referendum and a hypothetical win, is there a chance, do you think, that the Labour Party and the Conservatives, who, and let's face it, in recent elections, there have been calls from the leaders of these two Scottish branches of British parties to vote for each other in order to keep the SNP out using tactical voting. Is there a realistic possibility that if things get bad enough for Labour, that there might actually be some kind of general unionist party that forms out of the debris of the Scottish Conservatives and, shall we say, the more Brexit-oriented side of Scottish Labour?
I don't think that's likely. I think that some pro-unionists who are interested in that idea, and it's been floated before, if you tried to consolidate all of the pro-UK vote, as it were. But these parties are, despite the fact that they share the idea that Scotland should still be part of the UK, they're very different. They remember the bad experiences, particularly Labour, of being associated with the Conservatives. They're better together, and I don't think there's any desire to repeat that. So no, I think that Labour, is. I presume they think that things have gotten as worse as they were going to get, and how could they get any worse from here? So we might as well just continue what we're doing, or try to continue what we're doing. So no, I don't think there'll be a desire for, at least for Labour, to openly work with the Conservatives in terms of keeping the SNP or out. But I think that, and so that also, if we get to an independence referendum, I'm sure that the parties, the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems will all campaign separately, which could be interesting. That would obviously make things different from last time, and it may have less of an impact. For instance, I guess we'll have to see.
We've just spoken, at length about, shall we say, the unionist parties or the pro-UK parties in Scottish politics. But I wanted to ask you, Anthony, about the SNP's shift from what would appear to have been initially a cabinet-led government towards what I think I might characterise as more of a presidential style of government, where Nicola Sturgeon is very much in front of the cameras 24/7, managing the pandemic. And it appears, well, I mean, this is a perception perhaps, that the SNP has shifted its strategy a little bit. And do you think that was as a result of Brexit that this has happened, or has the pandemic altered the way the SNP strategy has unfolded? Do you believe that they've reacted to the pandemic more, shall we say, than they have to Brexit?
Well, I think there are a couple of different dimensions to your question, and I suppose one is, that the Scottish Government and the SNP's sort of, governance and communication style, and the other is their approach to Brexit and perhaps their approach to the pandemic. So, yes, in terms of the way in which the Scottish Government and the First Minister are communicating at the moment, I think that's really a consequence of the pandemic. The First Minister decided that she wanted to be front and center and to take the lead and communicate directly with the Scottish public on the pandemic. And that's a very clear strategy, and then arguably one that has worked for her and for her government. And that I think that was really a response to the pandemic and not to Brexit. In terms of the Scottish government's approach on Brexit, the SNP's approach on Brexit, I mean, we went into this knowing, of course, that the SNP is a pro-European party. It was before the EU referendum, and it still is one now. But I think that it's like, in terms of how people from outside view the SNP, I think its pro-EU stance has sort of solidified as a consequence of how the Scottish government has responded, particularly from at least the 2019 general election onwards. Because of course there are different views within the independence movement and within the SNP on whether Scotland should be part of the EU or part of EFTA or something else. And those divergences have always existed, but I really think that they have, the alternative arguments have been pushed to one side now. And the only thing really left is, pro-EU, pro-EU message of independent Scotland joining the European Union, not really thinking about EFTA as much anymore. And then that's quite interesting.
Anthony, in terms of the way that the SNP government in Scotland is now behaving in terms of, shall we say, its foreign policies, we've seen, as I mentioned earlier in the news at the top of the programme, the SNP is now calling for Scotland to be included back into the Erasmus scheme, and there seem to be major efforts being made by the European Union's nations in their parliament to try and find a way of including Scotland in Erasmus, even though Brexit has happened. And the other thing that I noticed recently, which I thought was interesting, was the fact that the Scottish government and the Irish government are now talking about a new working agreement between the two countries, which until recently you would have imagined was beyond the devolved scope of the Scottish Parliament, because foreign affairs is considered to be a reserved matter to the United Kingdom. Are these two developments, do you think, part of a new strategy or a new plan by the SNP to push the envelope of foreign affairs as far as they can before the United Kingdom begins to notice? Because I haven't seen any reactions from the United Kingdom government to either of these two moves. And I think that's interesting. Do you believe that the UK government has taken its eye off Scotland a little bit?
Well, I think you packed quite a lot in there. This is a very important area of how Scotland relates to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. It's one that I think about and write about a lot, and have a lot more to say as well. I think the ground, the foundation that I would always say, the starting point that I would always make, is that it's perfectly normal for a country like Scotland, even though it's not an independent state in the world, to have relations with its neighbours and beyond. I mean, that is very normal. If you look at, I don't know, German states, for instance, they all have relationships with other states beyond them, other countries, and that's not an issue. Of course, we have a challenge because there's an independence debate and everything is framed through that. But it's perfectly normal for Scotland to have relations with other countries. I wish we could all, agree with that and then move on from there. So there's that. Secondly, in terms of the bilateral review and bilateral relationship developing between Scotland and Ireland, I think that's a very important thing because, of course, Ireland is a crucial partner for Scotland now, and would certainly be one if Scotland became independent and was looking to join the European Union. The review focuses on devolved issues, and Ireland, is perfectly aware of the sensitivities of what the UK government thinks. I don't know why the UK government hasn't said much, but I'm perfectly aware that they would have been fully aware of the entire contents of the report before it was published, because the Irish at least would have told them. So no, it's a good thing to have that review published and for the steps to be developed in that relationship, and see what happens from there. In terms of the Erasmus letter, yes, of course it is definitely significant. Erasmus is a great thing. I went on Erasmus. It's a very valuable program. It would be wonderful if Scotland could be part of it. I think there are challenges to that because there's a vast difference between the European Union, in terms of the member states and the Commission being willing to do something, particularly if the UK government does not agree, versus what MEPs think. For a collection of MEPs, and obviously the European Parliament is very important, but it's in terms of you're looking across the different institutions of the European Union, I think the one that's more likely to express positions that may not actually translate into reality is the European Parliament, for various reasons. So no, it's all significant. I think there is a lot more that Scotland could do in this area. So to your point about is the Scottish government pushing the envelope? No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot more that could be done. This is an area where if thinking about Scotland potentially being independent, there's a huge amount of work to be done. It's important to be strategic about it and also to be clever about how you go about things, because Scotland has a lot to contribute to the world. Of course, it's doing that now, but I'm very confident it has a lot more to contribute as well.
Thank you for that, Anthony. I'd like to move on to one of the other major issues which you raised in your paper, and that was the way that devolution has changed because of Brexit and partly because of COVID. And you mentioned particularly in your paper the question of the Scotland Act of 1998, which originally established the Scottish Parliament, and its various sort of updated versions. And you described them as potentially obsolete and useless in your paper. In other words, that the British government itself had overridden the terms of the Scotland Act by involving Scotland in something against its will, where consent was withheld, and by enacting laws such as the Internal Markets Bill, which clearly trod all over all kinds of devolved areas. Is it your belief that the Scotland Bill and the devolution settlement, as it was before Brexit, is now just not fit for purpose?
I think it's clear that devolution has been fundamentally changed by the UK state in a way in which the people of Scotland, having voted for devolution as it was intended, it's not the same anymore. It has been fundamentally altered in many ways. Yes, sure. On the legislative consent procedure, which is what I was referencing, yes, it is. I think it's been proven to be useless. It was written into statute, and the Supreme Court said that it was not legally binding. We've had multiple pieces of legislation that the Scottish Parliament, on a cross-party basis, has refused to give legislative consent to that were enacted anyway. Large areas of competence that have been devolved for over 20 years are now spaces where the UK government feels that it wants to act on its own basis, and indeed through the UK Internal Market Act, limiting the effectiveness of devolved policies. And we could go on and on. What it goes down to is it shows the clear limits of devolution. No matter how many powers are so-called given from London to Scotland, anything can be taken away. Nothing is permanent, nothing is guaranteed. And it is all up to the UK government and the UK Parliament and their disposition. And that's that, unfortunately. I think that's been many people would have said that they always knew that, but I think for those who weren't so sure, it's beyond doubt now that the way at the end of the day, the UK government will decide, and short of independence, there's nothing that Scotland can do.
So basically, as I understand this, Anthony, when the Labour Party initiated the Scottish Parliament, which they kind of appropriated it, I guess, themselves, but when the Scottish Parliament was reopened, because it had never formally been abolished, the Labour Party said, and I think it was repeated recently, that the Scottish Parliament was permanent. But it now seems that although the Parliament is permanent, none of its powers are, which really makes you wonder, well, what's the point of having the Scottish Parliament if the British government can simply remove powers at the stroke of a pen? It seems like a rather pointless exercise for the Scottish government to be even complying with any of these new pieces of legislation, the Internal Markets Bill, for example. Would it be appropriate, do you think, for the Scottish government to refuse to cooperate with things like the Internal Markets Bill? Could they actually do that?
I think that the Scottish government, the present Scottish government, has always taken the view that it's important to, follow the legal system as it exists, even if you disagree with it. And I think that on balance, that is the right approach, even though it can be very frustrating. The whole point of Scotland becoming independent is for Scotland to have its own political autonomy and for people here to make the decisions about what happens in their own lives rather than being made at the UK level. And the way in which you get to independence demonstrates the kind of country that you become after independence. And a key part of the kind of country that Scotland would want to present to the world is a country that follows the rule of law, that follows the correct, the legal processes and systems as they exist, even if you disagree with them. Or fundamentally disagree with them, because that demonstrates that you are a country, that will be based on a rule of law and a, constitutional system, and that's sort of beyond doubt. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I
I think when you look at other
understand what you're saying. So you believe the Scottish government will follow the rules, even if they're unpopular, even if they disagree with them, because that is part of government's job, is to uphold the rule of law. I understand that. My next question was really sort of linked to this. But if the Scottish government is being disempowered by little bits and pieces of legislation, where the Scottish Parliament becomes less and less powerful, would it be true to say that you believe now is the time when the Scots must vote on independence? Because although the Scottish Parliament may go on in perpetuity, it may never have the same powers that it once had, and we could be heading for an era where literally the British government decides virtually everything for us, and we have a talking shop in Holyrood which has no powers.
Well, even though I said, I said a few minutes ago that I think devolution has definitely been fundamentally altered. The Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament, they still have responsibilities, and they still have powers and so on, and they still have things that they are responsible for doing that they are doing. So I think that they can and they will continue to do that. In terms of the timing of an independence referendum, of course, this is one of the most salient issues, I suppose, within the independence movement. And I understand people's desire to have a referendum soon. But I also think that it's important to take into account what's happening around us in terms of the coronavirus pandemic. And so, for instance, on that question of whether or not there should be a referendum this year, to be perfectly honest, I'm very skeptical about that because the pandemic is nowhere near over. It's very
Yeah.
hard to imagine people focusing their attention on that for a campaign. So I think that of course devolution is a very pressing issue, but I think it's important to think about where we are in terms of our current public health situation as well as the political situation.
You mentioned also in your paper the evolution of public opinion, and now by that I understand you to mean that the way people think about Scotland as either a devolved part of the United Kingdom or as an independent country has shifted in some way. We have seen, obviously, evidence of this in 18 consecutive polls since last summer, in which there have been varying degrees of support above 50%, the highest of which you mentioned was 58%. Do you think that that Brexit is the only thing that has been responsible for raising the support for independence, or have there been other factors involved in this as well?
Well, and indeed, I think it's up to 19. I think there's been a new poll in sort of the day since I wrote my piece. Things seem to be evolving so quickly as they have done over the past few years. No, I think there have been multiple factors, sure, and other people have talked about this in terms of the polling. We think about Brexit, yes, but also Boris Johnson, the UK government, Boris Johnson's style, his opinions, and his policy decisions. And of course, the way in which the Scottish government has acted on the pandemic versus how the UK government has acted or not acted. I think those things are all factors. But to me, I'm very confident that the main central factor, which has pushed people to who didn't support independence before, but who support independence now, is Brexit in all its various dimensions. The fact that Scotland has left the European Union and has a very distant relationship with the European Union. That the way in which Brexit has been conducted by the UK in terms of the issues we just talked about on devolution, for instance, or how it conducted, its preparations for the negotiations and the degree to which the Scottish government was not as involved as it wanted and thought was appropriate. And a general sense that the UK is going in a direction that many people here don't think is a good one. I think it's perfectly obvious that Boris Johnson, having so-called completed Brexit, wants to try to sort of sweep Brexit under the rug and talk about climate change and talk about democracy, which is pretty rich considering his track record, and just sort of sanitize the UK's international reputation. And that is something that I don't think people should let him get away with.
Okay. The Brexit, of course, is very real now for Scottish voters, and they're now experiencing the costs, the delays, the shortages, and the inconvenience of the reality of Brexit. Is it, do you think, or has it been a vital part in the Scottish Government or the SNP's policy to allow Scottish voters to feel the actual effects of Brexit in order to find this new level of support? Was it necessary, do you think, for it to go this far? In other words, was it necessary for the people of Scotland to be allowed to feel this this Brexit deficit?
I don't think so. I think that I think the Scottish government would say that they never wanted any of this to happen. They didn't want the UK to leave the EU. They didn't want the UK to have a distant relationship with the EU. So not to have Brexit in the first place. But if there was to be Brexit, for it to be a soft Brexit, in the single market, as close to it to being in the customs union as possible, and to avoid all of the difficulties. That's what they would say, and I think that is true. I think that it wasn't necessary to have Brexit to increase support for independence. We could have arrived at that through other ways. and so on. So it's just the way that things have unfolded. But I don't think that the Scottish government would have wished for this to happen because they recognize how bad Brexit is on so many levels. And of course, it also makes aspects of independence more difficult now of how to deal with a UK that is outside of the EU and in free fall in terms of its political system. Scotland will always have to manage that relationship and deal with that. And it would be nicer to have our closest neighbor have more political sanity. So that will always be a problem to manage.
I mentioned earlier on, Anthony, the issue of the change of style of government of the Scottish government, the SNP government, moving from a more traditional cabinet-led governance of Scotland to a much more individual person, Nicola Sturgeon being the figurehead, leading the country through the pandemic. Has that change in strategy, that change in emphasis from this group of governors, if you like, of Scotland, the government of Scotland, to the individual, has that had an effect on public opinion? Because anecdotally, I have heard many people who previously were anti-independence expressing a sort of grudging admiration for Nicola Sturgeon and agreeing that she was doing the right things. It must be having some effect.
Yes, I think so. Indeed, that's as I was, outlining, for instance, some of the reasons why I think support for independence increased. One of them for sure is the way that the Scottish government and the First Minister in particular have decided to confront the pandemic. And of course, a big part of that is the First Minister's communication with the public on what's happening. That as we know very clearly, that's a very different approach, both from the UK government, but also indeed from other European countries. If you look at, for instance, Ireland, daily briefings do take place, but they're given by the chief medical officer, for instance, and the Taoiseach only speaks on to the nation, as it were, when there's something very important to say. So there are different styles of how you communicate with the public. The First Minister has taken this approach, and yes, many people like the fact that they can see the Scottish government very clearly expressing what they're doing and what the public should know. And yeah, that would have, presented people who don't often engage in politics the opportunity to see things the Scottish government was already doing, in a sense.
It's an interesting situation we find ourselves in now, with Nicola Sturgeon being the central figure in the Scottish government. I know I'm going on at this a little bit a bit like there is a point to what I'm about to say, and that is that this contrasts greatly with the situation in 2014, where the public was repeatedly told that independence was not Alex Salmond's independence. It was bigger than one person. And however, Brexit and the pandemic seem to have turned that entire idea on its head. And it now seems that the opposite is true, which is a remarkable turnaround, is it not, in political fortunes of parties?
Well, I think that in terms of looking to the upcoming election, yes, all the opinion polls suggest that the SNP will do extraordinarily well. Perhaps with the greatest number of MSPs that a single party has ever won in an election, and of course Nicola Sturgeon is the leader of that party and is the person who will be credited with that great victory at the election, presuming that's what happens. All the polls say that would be what could happen. So yes, the SNP are in an extremely strong position in politics because of their own performance, but also, of course, because of the performances of the other political parties and their relative inability to present themselves as an alternative government, as it were. I suppose that it's certainly a very ideal position to be in as First Minister, to lead a party which has been in government since 2007 and is still clearly able to retain a very significant degree of public support. That's something that most politicians certainly would be delighted to have.
Now, we've been wondering here, Anthony, why it has taken so long for people's opinions to move in this direction. It seems to have been an extraordinarily drawn-out process and has only started to accelerate in the last, 12 months or so. obviously Brexit has been a catalyst in this process. But is there a reason why people were so reluctant to let go of the United Kingdom? Do you think there was something in the undecided voters' mind which was saying, you know, I don't know if it's safer to stick with the United Kingdom now or not? Was there a point, do you feel, in the events of last year where something changed?
Well, it's really a fascinating question because ever since the EU referendum, we were always wondering where would we see sort of the Brexit bounce or the Brexit boost in terms of support for independence. And I think we saw that for about a week or two after the EU referendum, but then it went back down to historic levels. So, why did it take so long, for instance, for people who were, perhaps could be persuaded on independence but weren't so sure, and then now have made that leap? It's hard to say, of course, why exactly that happened. I mean, we know that sort of the consecutive run which we're currently seeing in terms of support for independence that started around June of 2020. Uh, by that time, of course, the UK had already formally left the European Union. We were in the transition period. Boris Johnson was prime minister, and again, it's hard to say at this point. I'm sure there will have to be more comprehensive studies done in terms of analyzing public opinion and talking to more members of the public on it. But I think that it just reached a point where it crystallized in people's minds that not only had the UK left the EU, Scotland left the EU, even though people in Scotland didn't vote for that. But also that we were really looking at it, which is what we have, a really distant relationship with the European Union. But I think so. Again, it's the substance of having Brexit, having a distant relationship, but also seeing a UK government which time and again was very incompetent in negotiations, had very unrealistic objectives, pursued a course in terms of a remote, distant relationship with the EU that people in Scotland didn't want. And it's just a catalogue of failures and errors and poor judgment, and all of that together. I think there was a cumulative effect of recognizing that the way, as was alluding to before, that the way in which the UK state conducts itself and the way, where the direction in which the UK is going is fundamentally different from what mainstream opinion in Scotland would want. And I think that's the interesting point. It's not just a question of were you always a supporter of independence or have you just started to support independence now? It's that within Scottish society, within the Scottish mainstream, there are some sort of very common prevalent opinions that are just fundamentally different from how a lot of the politics works in England. Is saying this is not to say that everyone in Scotland voted to stay in the European Union. Of course, they didn't. There was a sizable chunk of people who voted to leave the EU. But across the mainstream of politics in Scotland, it's normal to be pro-European. It's not some sort of secret, difficult thing that you sort of hide, as you had to do, in UK politics, for instance, before the EU referendum. And it's just more, so I think all of those kind of, opinions and perspectives, people have just realized over time that the UK is fundamentally going in a direction that they didn't think was best for them.
I remarked a few years ago, Anthony, just after the Brexit vote and also after the election of Donald Trump, that given the fact that people at one time thought that both of those events were impossible, that there was no way Donald Trump would ever be elected as US president, and there was no way the UK was ever going to leave the European Union, and then eventually some other people were saying there's no way Boris Johnson could get elected as prime minister. All three of these events happened. And do you think perhaps that up until these things started to happen, that people were in a kind of state of denial, that they couldn't actually believe that this was going to happen? And when it did happen, they still didn't quite believe it. And when we get to the point now where Brexit has actually happened and it's now a reality and the transition period is over, that there is an epiphany amongst the voting public in Scotland.
Well, I think that all the extraordinary political and constitutional change which we have seen over recent years has probably sort of lowered the threshold of people's worry, as it were, or tolerance in terms of the kind of change they think both they think should happen or they think could happen. Yes, I imagine many people before Brexit, before Donald Trump, before Boris Johnson as prime minister, would look at independence and they might think it was an interesting idea, but just think that it was too much of a change or somehow unrealistic or that could just never actually really happen. But of course, it can happen, and of course, there are new arguments for why it should happen.
Yeah,
For Scotland to have something different than different than Brexit and different than Boris Johnson, and it creates new arguments and new imperatives for why independence makes sense in a way. So yes, yeah, we're in a space where political projects that some people might have thought were just always improbable. In a sense, while Brexit and independence are totally different things based on totally different premises and different values. Brexit shows that when you have a majority of people backing a position or a project, that even if it seems difficult or far removed or whatever, that it can happen,
yeah.
and would happen. So yes, I think that that has definitely had that kind of impact.
Well, maybe the momentum for this to happen now has reached that point, Anthony. My final questions this evening, with regards to your paper on Brexit's reorientation of Scottish politics, was actually one of the first parts of your paper, which was the independence referendum, a new independence referendum, and you pointed out that the SNP before Brexit, before it happened, had not really been considering an independence referendum as soon as this. But as things have unfolded with Brexit, it has offered us an opportunity. But my question really is the proposal put forward by the SNP at the moment is to hold another referendum, assuming a big win, obviously, in May, a majority SNP government or pro-independence government would then attempt to stage another referendum. Now, we know for a fact that all of the UK's political leaders are saying no to a second independence referendum, and the SNP is sticking to its guns at present on the Section 30 route as being the legal and legitimate way to obtain independence. But it's already been denied twice, once by Theresa May in, 2018, and then a second time by Boris Johnson when he was elected as Prime Minister. Is there any chance at all, in your opinion, that the SNP will be able to get a Section 30 order?
Yes, I do. I do think it's possible. I don't know how likely it is, but yes, I think it's possible. I think if we see an election where the SNP win a majority, or even if they win a larger majority than before in 2011, and also you add in the Greens. We haven't talked about the Scottish Greens and their role in Brexit, but also if they you add the Scottish Greens as well, and you get a healthy majority of the Scottish Parliament, even more than there is now, in favour of holding an independence referendum. I think regardless of what Boris Johnson wants, I think it becomes very politically unsustainable not to work to have a referendum. And that's in contrast to what he's saying at the moment. But I mean, obviously he flip flops like a sandal, so he can clearly change his positions when the circumstances change. So yes, and of course we have to see how other parties, for instance, how Scottish Labour would respond. Again, separating the question of do you support independence versus should there be a referendum. So we
Can
really will
I
just have to see what happens at the election and after that. But yes, I do think it's possible to agree a referendum between the Scottish Government and the UK government after the election.
Many people, Anthony, have argued that pursuing a Section 30 order would be to carry on down a political cul-de-sac because, according to many pundits, spokespersons, other politicians that I've spoken to, pursuing the Section 30 order, there is absolutely no consequence for Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister of the UK if he continues to say, no, I'm not going to agree to sign a Section 30 order to legitimise your referendum. Is there any way is there any circumstances that you can see in which Boris Johnson can be made to make that decision?
This is certainly a complex issue. I wrote about it in a paper for European merchants in the summer, and I intend to write about it more. But the short answer is, I don't think Boris Johnson can be obliged to agree a Section 30 order in terms of a legal obligation. But I don't think that's what matters. I think what matters is the sort of political obligation or political pressure. I think, of course, our starting point, I think, is always that if we know that with how the process should work, if the majority in Scottish Parliament wants a referendum, there should be a referendum. That's not a very complicated thing. So I think that that's something that, yes, Boris Johnson may have sort of a legal right to say, I'm not going to discuss this with you, but that's not the point. In terms of would there be consequences for them, I do think there'd be consequences for him, not least as I mentioned earlier, one of the sort of strategies Boris Johnson wants to try to deploy to sort of, make other countries in the world forget about Brexit is one to talk about climate change, but the other is to talk about democracy. He wants to sort of form this coalition of democracies around the world and rope in Joe Biden with it. I don't think that would be work. I don't think that would work out for him very well if he wants to sort of champion the UK as a bastion of democracy, yet have this whole situation of clear majority of the Scottish Parliament want a referendum and he just says no. So I do think that there would actually be political consequences, negative consequences for Boris Johnson internationally as well as domestically if he just rejected out of hand, a very clear result in the referendum. But I think it's important to circle back to the point you're making about is a Section 30 order the only route to a referendum? And I don't think so. I think the most important thing in this is to move away from this question of what is a legal referendum versus what is not a legal referendum. It's very difficult to say that any kind of democratic vote is illegal. What really matters is it binding? Is it something that will be put into effect? That's what really matters. And as long as the Scottish government and the UK government are agreed on a referendum and they agree to respect the result, whatever legal basis they decide to underpin it with, in my view, doesn't really matter.
Would you say, Anthony, that if the Scottish government were to, well, let's say the SNP wins in May, which we hope they will, and there is an increased majority for independence and a referendum is organised and the people are given a date and they turn up to vote and Boris Johnson still has not agreed to a Section 30 order and we carry on and have this vote, is there anything realistically that the British government could do to stop that?
Well, I don't necessarily think so. But again, it comes back to the point I was saying before. In my view, as a political scientist, I don't think that any kind of democratic event, be that an election or be that a referendum, could be labeled as legal or illegal in the sense of it actually happening. The question is, what is the consequence of that referendum, for instance? What is the result of it? And Scotland would become independent through a process of a democratic event, a process of negotiating with the UK government, a process of becoming a state. And fundamental to that, we're actually happening and actually working is for the UK government to work with Scotland. I mean, of course, you have to have both sides work together. And so, no, the question in my mind is not about the legal basis for a referendum. It's that both sides work with each other on it, not just for the referendum, but with the result of that referendum and how to put it into effect.
I have one last question for you in this particular section of the discussion. And actually, I'd love to continue talking with you about this for a lot longer, but we have little time this evening. My final question was, would you back a move to have the independence vote contained within an election in a form of a plebiscite? This is something which people have been proposing recently. It's a popular topic on social media. And perhaps let the United Nations and the EU decide if the Scots are entitled to leave the UK after decisive majority voting for independence. Is that something which you would back if it was proposed, that the idea that the pro-independence parties standing in the next general election would stand on a single issue, and if they have a majority of votes and a majority of seats, that they could then say, well, we the people of Scotland have spoken, we want independence, whether or not the United Kingdom agrees or not, we would seek the recognition of the United Nations and the European Union. Is that a possibility?
Well, I mean, I'm an analyst, not a politician, so I suppose it's less of a question of what I back as opposed to sort of what I think.
Can you see it happening, Anthony? Is it a possibility?
Well, so no is the short version. And again, I appreciate people's frustration that they want to see a referendum or they want to see independence happen. But we can unpick some of the points of that premise. First of all, the European Union has no role in this. The UK is not part of the European Union. Scotland is not part of the European Union. The European Union is not going to say a single thing about independence until or unless there's a referendum or a democratic event where
But if there is a
the majority of
democratic
people
event, Anthony, and it's a successful vote for independence, in your view, would the European Union or the United Nations then be forced to accept Scotland as an independent country and talk to the remains of the United Kingdom about negotiations?
Well, again, I think it's important to take a step back and to situate this in the wider context. I'm very clear that Scotland could become independent to be a successful member of the European Union, a successful member of the United Nations. But I think it's really worthwhile to get out of this kind of thinking. The United Nations or the European Union will not be forced to do anything. They will do whatever they want based on their own interpretations of their own interests and their own obligations and how they see things and how politics works and geopolitics work. The question I suppose is more of how can Scotland, despite the challenges and the difficulties, including the ones we've seen from Brexit,
Yeah.
find a way, however challenging, to work with the UK government to find a way forward. That they can agree hopefully a referendum and then to negotiate for Scotland to become independent and then apply to join the EU, apply to join the UN, and become successful in those.
Oh, Anthony, listen, it's been a joy to talk to you this evening. It's fascinating to read your report. I'd also encourage other people to look for Anthony's report online. It's called Brexit's Reorientation of Scottish Politics, and it was presented to the Royal Society of Arts. Anthony, thank you very much for being our guest this evening and for your fulsome answers to some of my stranger questions this evening. And that is about it from Scotland at 7, the special edition this Friday evening. I'll be back again on Monday with my usual slot at 7, so I hope to see you then. But of course, in the meantime, I have to tell you that we're having a major crowdfunder, and we're encouraging everybody who enjoys these programmes to contribute a little towards the success of this TV channel. We want to cover all the major events in the next 12 months, and there will be some huge events in the history of Scotland. And if you want us to be there, and you want to make sure that we can continue to make more programs like this, please support us. Follow the instructions on your screen now, go to our website, become a supporter or make an individual donation. And of course, as always, we always need volunteers. Anyway, that is about it from Scotland at 7 this evening. It just remains for me to thank Anthony for his excellent interview this evening, Anthony Salamone. And I will see you on Monday. A very good evening to you.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.
Hey.